How many people here have ever looked at the list of names scrolling up the screen at the end of a movie or at the end of a television show and looked to see which names were Jewish? Okay, so it's not just Americans. Good. How many people know, and here this is going to be specifically American, how many people know how many Jews are on the Supreme Court of the United States right now? Alessandra. Okay, a couple of you. Good. All of these are examples of Jewhooing. One that works really well with older audiences is the actor Tony Curtis. How many people know his real name? Nobody in this group. But trust me, if you had, good, Bernie Schwartz, right. Oh, did you say, yes, Bernie Schwartz. If you had a group of Jews over 55, 60, every single hand goes up, okay? Let's try something for the younger generation. Who knows Natalie Portman's background, where her family is from, number one? Israel. Do you know the name she was born with? Hirschlag, right. That's Jewhooing, what you've just done, what we've all just done. Every one of those, looking for Jews in the culture. It also probably can be related to, if I were to look around a room of strangers and try to figure out who's Jewish in the room, right? Have you heard the phrase Jewish radar or Judar, right? So Jewhooing is really the exact same impulse, but directed not at people in the room with you, directed at the culture. Trying to figure out who's Jewish. And knowing it, making it your business to know who's Jewish and who's not. Now, I wrote a book about this. I used this concept in the title. A lot of people, some people I love and respect, tried to warn me beforehand that, oh my God, you can't name a book that. It's so crass, it's so ethnocentric, it's so lowbrow. How awful. But you're gonna devote 10 years of your life to studying that quirk, that neurotic habit that a lot of Jews have of knowing the names of all the Jewish stars in Hollywood and so forth. The point is, what I argue in the book, is that it's really just the tip of an iceberg. That habit is quirky. It is a little neurotic, I want to suggest, but it reflects something much larger, which is the relationship Jews have as a minority group in this country with those of its members who have made it, who have succeeded, who have a public profile. Now you might rightly say, well, every group does that. Right? If any minority group is going to be proud of its famous members, if you're African American, if you're Italian American, whatever. I mean, in addition to the Jewish community, the gay community is very up on this. There's one of the people I interviewed is a lesbian artist named Deborah Cass, and she's quoted as saying that she says, we in the gay community, she said this to her mother. She said, Mom, we know who's gay in Hollywood the way you know who's Jewish in Hollywood, right? So there's a parallel, right? And actually that's helpful in beginning to figure out what this is about, because I make the argument that, yes, all groups do it, but Jews do it a little bit more. And by the way, I should point out that in my field, American Jewish Studies, we're very often making this argument. Now, on the one hand, we can't claim to be completely exceptional, because that's just not true. So we're always viewing Jews against the background of America in general, viewing them in comparison with other groups. We talked about the immigrant experience. We necessarily need to know what that experience was for any number of other groups in order to better understand the Jewish experience. And yet there's this subtle sub-argument that then is added, which is, as I said a moment ago, yes, but the Jews are still a little different. There is still something special, unique, separate about Jews. So why do you think that is with this subject, with celebrity? And a handy way to define Jewhooing is simply Jewish celebrity consciousness, the awareness of famous Jews. That's what Jewhooing is. Why do you think? And I'm asking questions because we call this a class, right? So I want to make it a little more interactive than usual. Yeah, Bertie, right? Yeah.
I think it's because we've had a history of being persecuted very much. So we take particular pride in seeing people of our people making it.
So again, the pride is that's the basic emotion. But as Bernie points out, our memory and our experience of anti-Semitism plays into it in some way as well, right? Because we've been put down, all the more reason we want to be lifted up. There's a wonderful song, there's a singer-songwriter named Dan Bern who wrote a song called Lithuania. It's about his family that didn't make it in the Holocaust. It's his song of Holocaust remembrance. And there's the chorus in the line is that I just want to dance on Hitler's grave and shout out Bob Dylan, Lenny Bruce, Leonard Bernstein, and there's all the famous Jews in America, right? Look, you didn't succeed, and it's a rejoinder to the greatest, anti-Semite in history, right? So yeah, I think that's certainly a piece of it. And it's interesting how we're all obviously conscious of anti-Semitism. It's interesting how often that comes up. I had a conversation with a student in class today. We were talking about Jewish migrations in the Middle Ages. And I asked the class the question, what motivated Jews to move? The first answer is fleeing from anti-Semitism, right? That's what we've all been brought up to think. And that plays some role at some times in history, but the far more important factor is economic opportunity, right? So let's just always keep in mind, now that we're a class, right? Let's always keep in mind that there are going to be multiple explanations and multiple factors, right? But that's certainly a good one. Any other thoughts? Yeah. And your name is? David. Easy to remember. Yeah.
Proof of assimilation. We're just like everyone else, and especially probably back in the 60s when...
Great. In other words, a famous Jew, by definition, has to be popular and liked by not just Jews, but by everyone. Right? Otherwise, they wouldn't be a celebrity in America. They have to play in Peoria. Do you know that phrase? Is that not a common phrase nowadays? They have to, it was an old show business term, to play in Peoria. It meant that, yeah, it's okay if it works in front of a New York audience, but if you're gonna make it with this play or show or whatever, it has to play in small town America also, right, where there aren't Jews.
I don't think that's true of Jewish comedians. I think it's specifically their Jewish identity that makes them more interesting. Like Jerry Seinfeld's or
But their Jewish identity makes them interesting to the rest of America, you're saying?
Yeah.
Right, okay.
So
But your enlightened stance on that is you're already a few steps ahead of many of the executives in Hollywood and television business. The most famous example is when Seinfeld and Larry David brought their TV show to the executives at NBC. Yeah. The executives, all of whom were New York Jews, said, "No, we don't want to pick this up. There's no way it'll play. It's too New York. It's too Jewish, right?" If they are perceived as Jews, and you're right that oftentimes, interestingly, comedians are more out about that than certain other fields of show business, right? Movie stars tend to be more assimilated, more closeted, let's call it, than comedians. Comedians can be, in part due to this guy, which we'll come to, tend to be more open, upfront about it. And you're right that their acceptance as Jews is the point here. But that's to say that we care about them, we celebrate them because they demonstrate that Jews are in fact accepted by the rest of America. So it's the same point. And I guess it's a better point if they're Jewish Jews, if they're Jewishly marked in some way. Okay, good. There are a number of historical factors that I think will bring this into sharper focus. First of all, what you've said so far is great. On the one hand, a famous Jew is someone that is accepted by America, so therefore their success, their acceptance is something that heartens us and in some sense reflects our own. American Jews, by and large, have been phenomenally successful in American society. So the famous celebrity represents that. At the same time, to whatever degree they're perceived as being Jewish, they also not only represent being a part of America, but they also reflect or symbolize that Jews still, to some degree, in some way, continue to remain a nation apart, separate from, distinctive. So they embody both the distinctiveness and the inclusion together. So that's our starting point. Once we dig a little deeper, there are some interesting other factors that I'd like to share with you. One is a nice part of Ashkenazic culture, a couple of values, social values that are embedded in Ashkenazic Jewish culture, and we see that in the language. Do people speak Yiddish? Do we have any Yiddish speakers? Not at all? No? Well, there are two terms in Yiddish which are both very important values in Jewish culture. I assume, is everyone here Ashkenazic? I mean, not necessarily, right? but most of us are. Certainly most Jews in the Western world are descendant of Ashkenazic Jews. Your grandparents spoke Yiddish, that makes you Ashkenazic, right? So the first word is nachas. Is that a word people know? Nachas is the intense pleasure derived from the achievements of children. Really, it's the achievements of someone else. Someone else's accomplishment, success, you derive pleasure from that. That's called nachas. Very important, as I say, value in this culture. And it became an even more important value in the American experience, especially after World War II in suburban Jewish life. One of my teachers at Brandeis University was a great figure in our field. He was the founder of the sociology of the Jews. His name was Marshall Sclair. He had a great theory about this. He believed that nachas became so important. It became important for parents in post-war suburbia to generate nachas. They needed to get as much nachas as possible, so therefore they gave their children everything, every possible opportunity, every possible advantage, so that the children would succeed and give them nachas. Right? So this really drives, according to Sclair, and his theory about it was that the reason that the bar and bat mitzvah became so important, a ritual, a ceremony, during those years, was that it was a way to encourage the children to continue giving nachas by marrying the right person several years later. Right? So the bar bat mitzvah becomes a kind of a dress rehearsal for the real event. Right? All of which goes to this notion of nachas. So my point simply is that that value is important in Jewish culture, and you can see, I hope, some relationship between that and the nachas we get from our famous Jews. Right? Another similar Yiddish term value is the word yichus. If you know Hebrew, it's the same word as yachas or yichasim. Well, yichus is not origins specifically, it's connections, right? Yechasim are relationships, connections. Yichus is the status or prestige you derive from being related to, in whatever way, someone big, someone important, a macher, right? So if your brother-in-law's next door neighbor's uncle is the head of a bank, you have yichus, right? You have some connection. Okay? Again, very important in Ashkenazi Jewish culture. You might suggest that these both are forms of status enhancement, which is necessary when you are in a situation of status deprivation. The European ghetto was just such a situation, and thus a number of social mechanisms were evolved to elevate one's standing, right? Either nachas from the children or yichus from your brother-in-law. Either way, they both serve as precedents, I want to suggest, for Jewhooing. This almost obsessive, neurotic behavior of caring so much about who's Jewish. So that's a little bit of that's an example of looking to Jewish history for some of the sources of this. Two other examples drawing on Jewish history are the central theological concept of chosenness. Am nivchar, chosen people, God's chosen people. Right? For centuries, this was this core belief of the Jewish religion. For traditionalist Jews, it still remains so. For those more liberal, more modernizing Jews in the world today, that's largely fallen away. They no longer have that literal belief in being God's special people. And yet, if you're going to promote Jewish survival, at some level, you have to have some notion of, you have to have a raison d'etre for Jewish existence. So I suggest in the book, and this is going to sound like a little bit of a stretch, but it makes sense in context. If you get the book and read the book, you'll see that Jewhooing can be understood as the secularization of chosenness by pointing to all the great Jews in history. Karl Marx was a Jew, Sigmund Freud was a Jew, Einstein was a Jew, Jesus was a Jew, right? We are special. Even if God didn't choose us literally speaking, look at history, look at where we stand, historically speaking. We are chosen in some sense. So I want to relate it to that. It's a way in which the modern Jew has taken and reshaped or reconceptualized certain elements of the traditional culture. Similar to that, I just mentioned Jesus. You know what? Jesus is, I think, without any question, the most famous person in the history of Western civilization. Would you all agree? He's the number one celebrity in Western society. What have we been doing, we Jews, what have we been doing for 2,000 years? Seriously, this is a constant throughout our history. We've been pointing out that he's one of us. We do it again and again. It pops up. Now that I've alerted you to it, you're going to begin seeing it. What we do, it's a habit ingrained in our cultural memory, is we Jewhoo Jesus. He's one of our boys. He's a nice Jewish boy who made it. So these are some of the things that, in thinking about Jewhooing, thinking about that habit, where it comes from, why Jews are so invested in it, these are some of the points that I make. One last one I'll add comes out of a fairly recent body of academic research, and that is work on popular culture in general, and specifically about celebrity. There's a relatively new field called celebrity studies. And so in doing this book, I had to acquaint myself with that field. And one of the basic points that's made explains why it is we as a society, as a culture in general, why we tend to be so fascinated by celebrity. Am I alone here? I mean, is this something that I share with you? I'll just give you a quick example. Happened in this neighborhood 3 days ago. I live on 82nd Street, and I was crossing Amsterdam at 83rd. And as I walked, do you know where the Hampton Chutney Company is? Does anyone know where that is? Okay. So as I'm passing it, out walks someone so famous that I stopped dead in my tracks, and I blurted out, "Oh my God, I could not believe who I was looking at." Any guesses? Anyone want to guess? It was Paul McCartney. Pretty darn famous, right? I mean, you too, I'm assuming, would get excited, would tell people about it afterward, right? So celebrity studies asks what's going on in that moment. What is it that so entrances us, that so excites us? And the general, are you okay? Sorry, next time, I'll let you know next time he's in the neighborhood, okay. The general answer is that the nature of celebrity is dualistic. Celebrities are larger than life. They are exalted beings. They are transcendent. They're, in some sense, the deities of modern day culture. And at the very same time, they are flawed, ordinary people who, like Paul McCartney, I was in shock not only to see him, but also to see him come out of a restaurant, which is to say, oh my God, he eats. Right? So in that moment, he is not only that transcendent figure, but he's also brought down to earth. And our awareness of celebrity resolves that dualism. So that's in a nutshell, that celebrity studies talks about that kind of resolution. Interestingly, Jews can be thought of in a similar way. According to our tradition, we are the chosen people. We are pretty darn special, are we not? And yet, our historical experience, as you pointed out earlier, has tended to knock us around quite a bit. We have continually been told by others that we are the lowest of the low. The history of anti-Semitism suggests that Jews are demeaned in some way. The tradition of Judaism suggests that Jews are close to God. Just like celebrity, both high and low at once, occupying a high status. And if you think about the way in which Jews are seen in society, in American society, European, what have you, there's a similar duality going on. People love us. Right? That's why the rate of intermarriage is so high. People think very highly of Jews. On survey research data tells us that Jews are admired as a group. Jews are respected. Jews are, in some sense, beloved. And yet, at the same time, to whatever degree anti-Semitism is still present, at the same moment, and sometimes by the same person, they're also seen as lowly. So in the same way that celebrity worship helps us resolve this duality of the human condition, it's especially powerful for Jews who have an especial need for resolution, to bring together high and low, to bring together heaven and earth, if you will. So that, and it's just by your body language, that of all my little theories here, that's the one that got you, right? That's the one that kind of cuts deepest and kind of feels most compelling in some way. So that's my little spiel about Jewhooing. Jewhooing, I want to suggest to you, has a history. There's a long section in the book which gives any number of examples of it, and we could go on with that and talk more about it, but I did want to at least give you this basic theoretical framework to think about Jewhooing. The second part is looking at 4 figures in particular and thinking about each one of them in this regard, and in particular to think about applying that dualistic notion to them. What is it about these figures that is both godlike and human, that both is beloved and reviled at the same time? Let me first back up though and talk about why I chose these figures. Bernie asked me before how I got interested in the 60s. Years ago, I was a grad student probably. I found a little, the memoir of a performer named Alan Sherman. Alan Sherman was a very popular singer, songwriter in the early 1960s. He becomes very famous for a couple of years, and then he fades away into obscurity. So really there's no reason. The one song of his you probably know is Hello Mudda, Hello Father, Here I Am at Camp Granada. That's his song about a kid at summer camp riding home to the parents. He was best known at the time, though, for writing dozens and dozens of song parodies where he took a popular tune, often from Broadway, and he would put his own lyrics to these songs. Usually the lyrics were about Jews and Jewish life. And they were just introducing Jewish subject matter, Jewish language, and Jewish sensibility, combining it with these very popular songs. It was a kind of a joke in and of itself. There's a song in the title I'm forgetting, but there's a line in it about the grapes of wrath. He turned this whole song into a description of the Jewish garment center, the garment industry. And so instead of the grapes of wrath, it was the drapes of wrath, right? So it was those kinds of twists which were clever, and people at the time, not just Jews, but everyone bought these records. Apparently, I think it was Cary Grant, a non-Jewish actor, who bought a bunch of them to take with him to England. He was on his way to see the Queen of England, and he wanted to share this great new American humor with the biggest Gentile in the world, right? So it really does extend beyond the Jewish community. So I picked up this memoir, and what I discovered was that there was something happening during those years in American life that enabled at least Alan Sherman, and I had to imagine there were more than just the one person, enabled people to begin expressing themselves Jewishly in popular culture. There had been Jews who were entertainers, comedians for quite a long time, but this is the moment, as exemplified by Alan Sherman and then many others, where they bring their Jewishness with them, where part of their fame, part of what they're known for, part of how they're seen, part of their art is going to be about Jewish life. And that's a very important moment for Jews because it enables the rest of us to feel more comfortable as a Jewish minority in what is essentially a Christian culture, a culture that for a long time was not very hospitable. So it's a very important turning point. And as a historian, I'm making a historical argument that turning point between the period of the 30s, 40s, 50s, when the keynote was assimilation, when you had to be worried about being too Jewish. You really were pressured in any number of ways to integrate, acculturate, assimilate. For a long time, that was the hallmark of American Jewish life. Most historians talk about a turning point coming in the late 60s. Any guesses what year in particular?
68.
One year off. 67 is the Six-Day War. The experience of the Six-Day War, that it only lasts 6 days, and yet it was tremendously jolting, even traumatizing to Jews around the world. The idea that, oh my God, another Holocaust could happen and we're standing by. And then after 6 days, when the Israelis come out with this miraculous victory, that sense of pride and self-congratulation and hope for a future just energized and electrified the Jewish world. So usually historians talk about that moment being the moment when Jewish pride comes back, when Jewish identity is recharged. And that's very true. I mean, it was a scintillating moment, there's no question. What I look at is several years before the Six-Day War, 1961, 62, 63, when some of this pride, some of this willingness to identify is already beginning to bubble up. So it doesn't come out of the blue in 67. There is a preceding period. So that's the historical part of it. Just very briefly, the early 60s is a fascinating moment in terms of Holocaust consciousness, in terms of identification with Israel, in both cases because of popular culture. Start with the Holocaust. It is in 1961 that the Israelis capture Adolf Eichmann and put him on trial in Jerusalem and televise that trial. So that for the first time, even though in the Jewish community, a colleague of mine has written a wonderful book about the way in which Jewish leaders and educators made an effort from the moment the war ended. There was an effort in the Jewish community to commemorate the Holocaust. Interestingly, they didn't yet use the word, right? So they were talking about the catastrophe or the 6 million, not yet the Holocaust. But still, it's not as if Jews ignored this altogether. Nevertheless, it was not a subject that anyone thought was of interest to anyone else. It seemed to be an entirely parochial topic. With the trial of Eichmann in 61, everyone becomes riveted. And it enables and gives license to Jews to become all the more interested. Just after the Eichmann trial, the end of 1961, a Hollywood movie comes out about the Nuremberg trials called The Judgment at Nuremberg, a major Hollywood blockbuster about the Nazi war crime tribunals. Right? So there's something going on in the culture. And I can give you any number of other points of turning, of change in that moment. Regarding Israel, there's a 1-2 punch of a best-selling novel that comes out in 1958, and then a movie made from it in 1960. It's called? Is that again? Yes, Exodus. Yes, Exodus. It's okay. Your pronunciation is a little off, but you got the right movie. Exodus. Exodus. Imagine what that film, what impact that had for American Jews and other Jews around the world at that point in time. In 1960, the first non-Protestant American president had just been elected. So that also is an important turning point, the election of JFK. The civil rights movement was just moving into full swing. So things are happening, things are changing. This is what sets up the 60s. For Jews in that moment, there is also a renewed sense of identification with their people, with their history, with their common challenges and suffering and so forth. And it is a very powerful moment for them, which shapes and in a sense reshapes Jewish identity. Several years before the Six-Day War. Now, having read about Alan Sherman, I'm interested in celebrity. So who are the celebrities at that moment? Well, I discovered a very nice coincidence. In the fall of 1961, okay, so Kennedy is elected at the end of 1960. He's inaugurated in January 61, the first year of the Kennedy administration. In September of that year, September 27th, 1961, a baseball pitcher named Sandy Koufax had been for a long time a member of the Brooklyn Dodgers. In 1958, they moved to Los Angeles, the LA Dodgers. September 27, 1961, he sets his first major league strikeout record. The several years before that he'd been a player, he was struggling, he was floundering. That's the moment where he becomes great. And over the next 6 years, from 61 to 66, he becomes one of, if not the greatest pitcher in baseball history. Extraordinarily successful as an athlete, as an American sports figure, and he's a nice Jewish boy from Brooklyn. Now, the Jewish part and the baseball part don't come together immediately. They do beginning in the early 60s, but then something happens in 1965 that will turn Sandy Koufax into one of the great Jewish heroes of all time. The World Series, by this time he's a major star, his baseball prowess is well established. He's set to pitch the first game of the World Series that year, Dodgers against the Minnesota Twins out in Minneapolis. And it just so happens that the first game of the World Series falls on Yom Kippur. What to do? Sandy Koufax, the great American baseball star, makes the decision not to pitch on the holiest day of the Jewish year. That one act on his part has catapulted him to the level of a Jewish saint. It's astounding. And you scratch a Jew and you mention Koufax to them, and they will say to you back, the 1965 World Series. 2 days later, September 29th, 1961, the guy in the upper left-hand corner was at that point, a very well-known comedian. He had been, over the past few years, beginning in the late 50s and then moving into the 60s, he was becoming one of the most famous comedians in America. His name was Lenny Bruce. September 29th, 1961, he's arrested for drug possession. Apparently he'd been at a party the night before, he insulted some local alderman, and the guy called up the local police force and had them break down his hotel door, and they found some prescription drugs and they hauled him off and arrested him. Over the next few years, wherever he went, whichever city he was performing, he would be continually hounded by law enforcement. Either they tried to get him on drugs, or they began coming to his club appearances and arresting him for obscenities, for using certain words on stage in public that they felt was illegal. 5 years later, several years later, those words were being used by every comedian on every stage around the country. When Lenny Bruce did it in 1961, it was asking for trouble. And so he will be, as I say, hounded by law enforcement. He will decline, his career goes off the rails, he will get further into drugs. In 1966, he will die of a drug overdose, but without first having changed the culture. And I'll talk more about that as well. His Jewishness is also a fascinating issue, and I'll come back to it. On that same date, September 29th, 1961, the New York Times music critic published a review of an unknown folk singer who was performing in Greenwich Village in various clubs. And this review absolutely quelled. This review was just the best possible review of a young, still unknown folk singer named Bob Dylan. That same date. A month later, Barbra Streisand is a year younger than Dylan. Dylan is 20 years old. Barbra Streisand is 19 years old, living in the city, also performing in Greenwich Village clubs. She auditions for her first Broadway show. That same moment, all four of these hit the scene or make their mark, jump into our mass consciousness at almost precisely the same moment. So in studying them, four of them together, my main interest is four different versions or variations on the theme of famous Jewishness. But the fact that they're all emergent at the same moment enables us to look at that period of time, that moment in history, and to think about that as well.
Do you still consider them Jewish if they don't consider themselves Jewish?
Oh, that's a great question. It's a great question. So Dylan is the best example. You're thinking about Dylan when you ask that question? Dylan's the best example. Not only what you're thinking about is that he becomes a born-again Christian, literally. Yeah. In the late 70s, for about 3, maybe 4 years, he goes off the deep end completely. He begins preaching, proselytizing. He's getting up on stage and singing his gospel songs and preaching Christianity, right? I mean, and here I'm Jewhooing him, right? My interest is much less in how he thinks and feels about himself and how he attempts to project himself, and more ultimately in how we see him. That's why Jewhooing is the key. It's how we project Jewishness onto him. In the case of Dylan, it's precisely because he makes such a clear attempt to escape. There's no question. He is about assimilation, whether Christian or not. He doesn't want to be seen as a Jew from the very beginning. There's no question about it. And that continues to this day, that he does everything possible to evade Jewish identification. For that very reason, we have been all the more active in making him a Jew. So that's what the book documents, is that extraordinary record of the Jewhooing of Bob Dylan. It's crazy. It's beyond what you can imagine. Celebrities most often tend to be assimilated. In other words, there are, with the important exception of Matisyahu, and maybe Bob Dylan's nephew, Peter Himmelman, and a couple of other individuals, the overwhelming majority of famous Jews are not particularly Jewish, right? There's always that tension, right? That they, on the one hand, they represent us. We look at them by Jewhooing them, And yet, they're not necessarily the best representative of Jewish culture and Judaism and so forth. They're not particularly Jewish Jews. There's that problem throughout. What I'd like to suggest, Alessandra, is that it's a problem not simply of the celebrities. It's our problem as a community. It's something that we grapple with, right? Whether our children will be Jewish, who we marry, whether we can sustain viable Jewish communities, whether we can pay the bills at our synagogue, I mean, et cetera, et cetera. There are so many challenges facing us as Jewish Jews, right? One of the context for that challenge is that most of our fellow Jews are like the celebrities, right? That's unfortunately the norm. The majority condition is in fact reflected by this assimilation, this public assimilation that we're talking about. So again, Jewhooing, one of the motives for Jewhooing is it helps us to work out or otherwise resolve internal conflicts, the tensions that we experience as Jews in the field, in the real world. Jewishness and celebrity don't go together particularly well. That's why Matisyahu is so fascinating a figure. Am I leaving anyone else out? A very Jewish figure who's also very famous. You know what's interesting? Oh, good. Woody Allen is good. Woody Allen is going to be very much like Streisand. Of my four, she's going to be the one who is going to be very comfortable with her Jewish background, and even more than that, she's going to use it in the construction of her celebrity. Woody Allen does the same thing. It's a tool for him. Who is a Jew? Right. So one of the first questions, since the subtitle of the book is American Celebrity and Jewish Identity, in the introduction, it enabled me to write a fairly lengthy piece about Jewish identity, which is great because it was a nice opportunity for me. It was something I always wanted to write about. And so I got the opportunity now. I'm turning that into an article, and I've kind of given that as a conference paper and so forth. So the first question of Jewish identity is, who is a Jew? The first use of the phrase Jewish identity refers to how do you define someone as a Jew? Who's in that category and who's out, right? In Israel, it's a political issue. It's a question of who is included in the polity of the Jewish state. It was in 1958, and this also goes to my early 60s emphasis. It's in 1958 that Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion issues a worldwide query, asking Jewish experts around the world, mostly rabbis, who is a Jew? Right? We have this halachic traditional definition, but does that still work in a post-Holocaust world? Does that still work in a world in which there is a secular Jewish state? Ben-Gurion wanted to know, and what he did by putting out that question was he sparked this debate, which goes on to the current day. Who is a Jew? Are the Falasha community from Ethiopia, right? They moved en masse to Israel. They claim that they are descendants of the tribe of Dan. Does the state of Israel see them as Jews? Who is a Jew? But it's been, as I'm sure you know, it's been a very heated, controversial issue, right? So my point simply is that it's not a closed question. It's an ongoing, open debate, and your relating it to celebrity is beautiful because that's my contention. That part of our interest in these people, someone like Bob Dylan, is he a Jew anymore? And yet we still want to think of him that way. So what we're doing is, in a certain way, we are grappling with the question of who is a Jew. We're using Dylan for that purpose. It's not so clear-cut. We would like it to be clear-cut. It would make us feel more comfortable in our own Jewish skins if it were clear-cut. But if modern-day Israel has taught us anything, it's that it's a complicated issue. There's a famous case. Brother Daniel was a Catholic priest, survivor of the Holocaust, who was born Jewish. After the war, he makes Aliyah based on the law of return. He claimed to be a Jew. The guy's a Catholic priest. Went to the Israeli Supreme Court. Is he a Jew or not? I'm not even going to tell you the answer. The point is, it's a quandary in the modern world. One of the illustrations of Jewhooing was on Saturday Night Live in I think it was the late 70s. There was Saturday Night Live often does spoofs of game shows, right? So they had a made-up game show called Jew, Not a Jew. And it was 3 Gentile couples who were competing, and then the host was played by Tom Hanks, who was the guest host that week, I guess. And he would put up an image of a famous person, and then they had to compete to see who could guess whether it was a Jew or not. So the first person they put up was the actress Penny Marshall. Jew or not a Jew? Do you know? She's not a Jew. She's Italian. Everyone thinks she's a Jew. And yes, but that wasn't put up. So the next person that was put up was the actor Michael Landon from Bonanza and Little House on the Prairie. Jew or not a Jew? Jew. Okay. But not so you'd know, right? In other words, he's well known, but it's not so well known that he's Jewish. Oh, that's right. And then the third image they put up on the screen was the mayor of New York. That's what reminded me. At that time, it was Ed Koch. And as soon as they put up the image of Ed Koch, all three contestants buzzed, going, "He's a Jew! He's a Jew!" Right? So basically taking this phenomenon of Jewhooing and mocking the heck out of it, right? For good effect. Let's go to the images, okay? The first figure is Sandy Koufax, as I suggested to you before. Incredibly important figure in the history of baseball. Just a devastating pitcher. If you're a baseball fan, you really have to appreciate how great he was. So the chapter on Sandy Koufax is titled Super Jew. And that wasn't my phrase. He was called that. During his career, some of his teammates, some people in the press began calling him Super Jew. And what's nice about that is just that phrase alone contains the duality, right? He was a Jew who was a super baseball player. He was a super athlete, right? Which contradicts the stereotype of Jews as not being athletic and not being big and strong and good in sports, right? So he contravenes the stereotype, which is always a powerful thing. But what super Jew means to start is that he was a super athlete. He was a Jew, a super athlete, hence super Jew. Once he makes that statement during Yom Kippur of 1965 and becomes a Jewish hero, a religious hero, super Jew takes on a different meaning. He's not super as a baseball player, he's super as a Jew. And that's the way he's often seen. Of course, the irony is that, and it's great because to this day, there are any number of synagogues or shuls around the Minneapolis area that either the rabbi or some older member will swear up and down that they remember Sandy Koufax coming in to shul and they saw him in the back. You get the same story at several shuls around town. The truth of the matter was he spent the day in his hotel room, okay, which we now know from the journalism of Jane Levy, of this biography that I mentioned. So Sandy Koufax, I want to suggest to you, looks Jewish, especially as against, at that time, baseball was almost entirely white, sun-bleached farm boys from Iowa, right? That was what baseball was populated with at the time. Koufax stood out as an ethnic, as a dark-featured ethnic person, in a sense non-white, in a sense non-Goyish. Look at this image. That's him with Whitey Ford. Sandy and Whitey. You gotta love the name Whitey. Here's a book cover. This is Jackie Robinson. That's a Zach Wheat. Notice what the artist didn't do this intentionally, but isn't it interesting that Koufax has the complexion of Jackie Robinson, the great, Jackie Robinson, for those of you who don't know, was the one who broke the color barrier in baseball, the national pastime, right? Here's an example of what I call the Jewhooing literature. There is a tremendous, go to the bookstore, the bookstores that still remain, go to Barnes & Noble. There is a whole shelf of great Jews in sports, great Jews in comedy, famous Jews, right? There's just a tremendous popular literature. Most of it is meant to be given as a gift for bar bat mitzvahs. It's not a serious literature, but I was able to use it to what I think was great effect. The way in which, just by including him on this cover, how it makes him more Jewish in a certain way. Even the photo of him sort of looks to me more Jewish. The fact that he's between Groucho Marx and Betty Friedan. Does everyone recognize everyone? The only one you probably don't recognize is Meyer Guggenheim, but you all know that Steven Spielberg, Barbra, Groucho, Betty Friedan. Everyone know who Betty Friedan is? Betty Friedan published in 1962, The Feminine Mystique, which started the feminist movement. She's the matriarch of second wave American feminism. Her maiden name is Goldstein. Okay. So by putting Sandy Koufax between Groucho and Betty, to me he looks like he's their secret love child. Right? By putting these 6 Jewish faces together, it's making a point, a subtle point, but a point nonetheless, that Jews are kind of a family. They're a tribe. And this way of thinking about Jews is not particularly popular nowadays. Right? We tend to emphasize much more our religious commonality and or our cultural or historical union. The idea that we're an ethnic group, a descent group, is not very popular, especially as intermarriage has become more common. Right? So by putting out a book like this, and by Jewhooing, you're almost sort of pushing back against that. There's a long section in the book comparing the Greenberg story with the Koufax story. It's a very important point. Just very briefly, you're right that they both took off for a high holiday. You're right that they both were very important symbols for the Jewish community. And you're right that they both were great Jewish ball players. Beyond that, it's almost all contrast. One of the key contrasts being Hank Greenberg, he achieves his stardom in the 1930s, Koufax in the 1960s. Those are two entirely different periods for Jews in America. The other missing link between Greenberg and Koufax is Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson really occupies the territory between them. Greenberg and Jackie Robinson overlap by 1 year. Greenberg could relate because he lived in a time when anti-Semitism was rampant. As you pointed out, Ford, it's not just Ford, it's America at that time. Post-World War II, and then in the 60s, by comparison, anti-Semitism is a non-issue. I mean, it always exists to some degree, but comparatively, it's gone. And so Koufax is going to serve a different role, and he's going to occupy a different symbolic niche in that regard. So, and finally, last point on Koufax, this happened in May of 2010, a couple years ago. The Congress of the United States had instituted something called Jewish American Heritage Month a couple years before this. And in 2010, for the first time, the White House celebrated this officially at the White House. So Obama invites to the East Room of the White House a group of Jewish notables, of famous Jews, and President Obama stands up in front and he looks out at the crowd and he says, pretty fancy group here. We've got senators and congressmen and Supreme Court justices and astronauts and tennis players and gymnasts and entrepreneurs and Sandy Koufax. To which the entire crowd all laughed and applauded. And then he added, President Obama did, he adds, and Sandy and I have something in common, we're both lefties. He can't pitch on Yom Kippur, I can't pitch. Ba-dum-bum. It was just a very sweet joke that the president made, but the point is that everyone in that room got it. Every single person was fully aware of Koufax's claim to Jewish fame, that he didn't pitch on Yom Kippur. Even President Obama now knows the story. The latter part of the chapter on Koufax talks about the various ways in which he has been turned into an icon in contemporary Jewish culture. He pops up again and again and again. And so I write about Jon Stewart has made reference to him, and there was a Coen Brothers movie that made reference to him, and Larry David makes reference. It just keeps popping up in the South Park, or The Simpsons or South Park, one of them had an episode about Koufax really has become an icon almost without peer. Possibly Barbra Streisand is the other very, very famous Jew that competes. So that's Koufax. This is Lenny Bruce. Let's go through it. This is him as a young comic. His mother was an entertainer, so he basically goes into the family business. Her original name was Sadie Kitchenberg, but she performed as Boots Malloy. She was like a sort of a burlesque performer and dancer. So he's going into the family business. He's in the Army during the war, or rather the Navy. He comes back after his military service and becomes a comedian. But for most of the 50s, he's just a schlock comedian. No one pays any attention to him. He tells terrible jokes. And so he begins doing crazy things. Since he's not making it in show business, he begins turning his life into a performance. So sometime during the 50s, he marries a Catholic woman named Honey. So now that he's married to a Catholic and he's kind of learning about Catholicism, he's intrigued by this. And so he decides to become a priest. And he grows a beard. This is not like Dylan, because this is not at all sincere. It's a gag, it's a joke. He grows a beard, and he begins knocking on doors in wealthy Catholic neighborhoods, telling people that he's collecting money for the Brother Matthias charity, And since he's there, would they care to give him their confession? For a couple of years, he's pretending to be a priest. Why does he do it? Well, partly it's a way to make a little extra money, but mainly it's because he thinks it's funny. And it's a way for him to exercise his comedic sensibility. And he's going to do this again and again. As you see, he gets arrested he gets arrested for vagrancy, but basically it was for impersonating a priest. That's right. As we come to the end of that decade, his comedy begins to change. He gets a divorce from Honey. He goes through a period of personal turmoil, and his comedy becomes much darker. And here's an example of probably the darkest possible humor, and that is to make humor from the Holocaust. Holds up a magazine, 6 million Jews found alive in Argentina. Now, from our current perspective, it's in terrible taste. But I want to point out that in the early 60s, no one was talking about it one way or the other. So just the very fact that he's broaching the subject is important. It's happening right around the same time as the Eichmann trial and so forth. So Holocaust consciousness is just really coming to the fore. Mel Brooks would write his play about Nazis called The Producers a few years after this. So Lenny Bruce, in a certain way, precedes that. Right? Then he starts getting arrested for real, and this is one of the better-known mugshots of him. He also was a family man, however. He had a daughter with Honey named Kitty, and he was a devoted father and husband. Here's the cover of a book that comes out after his death. This comes out in 67 or 8, a year or two after he dies, called The Essential Lenny Bruce. It is basically his stand-up routines transcribed and turned into book form. First chapter is about racism in America. It's called Blacks. Second chapter is called Jews. And it's just one routine after another about the Jewish condition, about Jewish issues, about anti-Semitism, about the Holocaust, about religion, about Jewish identity. His most famous routine, I should say most famous from a Jewish perspective, is a routine called Jewish and Goyish. Does that ring a bell for anyone? In which he basically says, Alex, you know it, he basically says, he lists things that are Jewish versus things that are Goyish. And so to start, I will in a moment, to start, I mean, that sounds familiar. We're all more or less, we tend to think, certainly our grandparents thought in those terms, and to some degree we still divide the world along similar lines. It's fairly typical, I want to suggest, of Jewish culture to think in that divided way. But then Lenny Bruce subverts it. He turns it on its head. And he says, Eddie Cantor, remember Eddie Cantor, famous Jewish comedian from the 20s and 30s, and B'nai B'rith, Goyish. Ray Charles, Count Basie, Jewish. And he goes on and on in this vein, calling things Jewish and things Goyish that completely, mess with you. And then the famous line from that routine was that Italians in New York are all Jews. In fact, everybody in New York is Jewish. If you live in Butte, Montana, even if you're Jewish, you're Goyish. Right? So it contains some sociological truth, but it also played on that division, on that traditional way of thinking that reflects so many Jews and so much of Jewish culture. He's in a sense challenging that. He's certainly playing with it. So he has a tremendous amount of Jewish material, much of which came from this book. Also, like the cover illustration, shows the way in which American legal authorities attempted to shut him up. There are many people who claim that he was not, that he didn't just die of an overdose, but rather that he was martyred, that he was so continually hounded, it's they who drove him to death. It's one perspective. And here's another way of seeing him Jewishly. This is his Jewish grave, which he's given back his original name, Schneider. Bruce was his stage name. And once again, it kind of, in a funny way, sort of humanizes him, going back to our dichotomy of celebrity. Very few people visit this grave. It's sort of in a remote place in Los Angeles. I teach at Hofstra on the Island next to Mineola, which is where he grew up. So one of these days, I still haven't done it. I intend to go and find his childhood house and make a little pilgrimage. But the point is that there is the public art of these people, and then their lives, and the two don't always fit together very, very easily. Bob Dylan was interested in Lenny Bruce. Several years after Bruce died, he recorded a song called Lenny Bruce, in which he said, "He was the brother I never had. He was more of an outlaw than you ever were," basically speaking to himself. In other words, sort of measuring his own rebelliousness against Lenny Bruce. He clearly saw Lenny Bruce as a hero, as did an entire generation. You talked about the Jewish counterculture, the hippies. The hippies saw Lenny Bruce as their patron saint. Abbie Hoffman, one of the great yippie leaders, dedicates his book, Woodstock Nation, to Lenny, our teacher. And he called him his God. One of the people I interviewed was a guy named Paul Krasner, who together with Abbie Hoffman was one of the founders of the Yippies. And Krasner said that Abbie Hoffman once said to him, when they first met, and Abbie Hoffman discovered that Krasner knew Lenny Bruce and worked with Lenny Bruce, he said, "He was my God." So even though he's gone, by the time we get to that part of the 60s, his influence is still very much, very, very evident. So Bob Dylan. Are people Bob Dylan fans at all? Yeah? A little bit? Okay. Extraordinary figure, even if you don't like his music. A lot of people hate his voice, for example, right? But the more you learn about him, the more you're going to appreciate his cultural achievement. I have one friend who says that someday people will look back and say that Bob Dylan was the Shakespeare of the 20th century, and that's the high estimation that some people have for him. There's no question that he revolutionized popular music in this country. But one can also argue that he was, as a songwriter, as a lyricist, he was one of the great artists of the 20th century. He really is an extraordinary figure. And extraordinary also in the terms we were talking about earlier, this question of his Jewishness. Look at his high school graduation photo of Robert Zimmerman. Nice Jewish boy, right? You don't see it in this photo, but in high school yearbooks, we used to write who we aspire to be or what our ambitions are. He wrote he wants to be the next Little Richard. Little Richard was a black rock and roller, right? So nice Jewish boy, grows up in a small town in northern Minnesota, wants to be Little Richard. He, at the age of 20, after he spends less than a year in college, he moves to New York to become a singer. And he immediately starts performing in Greenwich Village folk clubs, along with the many other folk revivalists and bluegrass revivalists of the time. There was a folk revival in full swing at the time. He becomes a part of that. So, for example, he would perform with other groups like the Greenbriar Boys, a bluegrass band. What the name doesn't tell you is his name is Alan Rinsler, a nice Jewish boy, and the other members of the group were also Jews. Many of these figures in that folk revival were, in fact, Jews pretending to be cowboys or folkies. So really, that in itself is a fascinating story. Dylan becomes a part of that. For the first few years, nobody necessarily knew that Dylan was Jewish. It begins to come out little by little. And then in 1963, so I don't have an image for it, but in 1963, as his star is on the rise, Newsweek magazine does a profile of him and does a little research and discovers that he's the son of a furniture dealer named Abe Zimmerman, and that he's Jewish and that he's a phony, basically, right? So they write that in an article in National Magazine, and Dylan is out. The cat's out of the bag. So from that moment on, other people are going to become aware of and interested in his Jewishness. He will maintain a fairly consistent stance of not being Jewish, except interestingly, he keeps hanging out with other Jews. Again and again, he associates himself with other Jews, his friends, his fellow musicians, photographers, you name it. And he then marries a nice Jewish girl, originally named Shirley Nosnitsky. She later becomes a Playboy model, Playboy bunny, and she changes her name to Sarah Lowndes. Sarah Lowndes becomes Mrs. Bob Dylan, and together they raise a lovely family. And as you may know, one of his kids, one of the kids in this photo, becomes a very well-known musician as well, Jacob Dylan of the Wallflowers. The Jewhooing of Bob Dylan, huge subject. Here's just one example of a magazine published by a guy named Stephen Pickering, which is a lengthy discursus on how every word of every Dylan song has rabbinic and Kabbalistic meaning. How Dylan is the Hasidic revival of contemporary Jewish life. Dylan himself has no interest in this, and yet people like Pickering are going to, he spent a good 10 years of his life putting out one magazine after another on this issue of how Dylan is the heart and soul of Yahadut, of Judaism. I'm not doing it justice because the detail is really what is so impactful, but he uses this photograph on the cover of one of his magazines. When Dylan turned 30, he visits Israel for the first time, and this is a photo that a UPI photographer took of him at the wall, holding a kippah on his head. It's the one photograph we have of Dylan, or actually one of two, the other one being this, where he is, in a sense, Jewish. When one of his sons is bar mitzvah, he takes him back to Israel. This is now in the 80s, and this photo is taken of him again at the wall, now laying tefillin. Very unusual, in fact, even shocking when you consider that this is a guy who 3 or 4 years before this photo was a born-again Christian. Right? So part of the fascination of Dylan is just his protean quality of ever-changing, constant chameleon-like changeability. His original Jewish name, Zimmerman, will be used again and again. This is a bootleg album. I'm not going to tell you the story of the thing with Weberman, but it's an example of when he's called Zimmerman, it's another way of calling him a Jew. And that comes up again and again. Here's a good example. National Lampoon magazine does this spoof on comic books. Instead of the adventures of Superman, it's the adventures of Zimmerman. So Dylan is the superhero. In this case, he's also affiliated here with Israel. He's like the superhero of Israel. Who's his secret identity? Robert Zimmerman. Right? That's the Clark Kent behind the scenes. Right? Do you know the I Love New York logo? Right? The graphic artist who did that is a guy named Milton Glaser, probably the best known graphic artist in America. This is one of his other very famous images. Put out in 1967, he was asked by Dylan's record company to do a poster of Dylan. And this is what he comes up with. And talk about duality. What's the first thing you see? It's the hair. What does the hair represent? The 60s, the countercultural, psychedelic moment of flower power and so forth. Dylan's a very important part of that. But what's the other part of this? Is the blacked out silhouette. So on the one hand, the face, the seat of identity, is black, is unknown, is mysterious. But at the same time, you also get to see the contour of his profile. And Dylan, I think it's fair to say, has a nice Jewish nose. So I also got to ask Mr. Glaser if he intended to make Dylan Jewish. And Mr. Glaser, who's Jewish himself, said a very nice thing. He said to me, well, not intentionally, but you never know what lies in the subconscious. And really, ultimately, all of this is kind of, subconscious. What you then find again and again are images of Dylan where the nose is disproportionate. If this were in Der Stürmer, it would be, that was the Nazi newspaper, this would be an anti-Semitic image, would it not? Dylan with that kind of large, distended nose. In fact, it was on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine. A Jewish artist named Robert Grossman did this, someone who loves Dylan, and yet, the caricaturing of him focused on that element of him. It's going to happen much more often in Europe, where again and again and again, you get images like this. And I think it's not unfair to call it anti-Semitic. Barbra is, first I just have to share with you that having collected all this memorabilia and artwork, I've got like dozens and dozens and dozens of posters and framed prints and you name it. So what do you do with all that stuff? So I was living in my apartment in Queens for a couple of years, assuming I was going to leave, so I wasn't putting anything up on the walls at first. I finally gave in. I finally put stuff up on the walls. So my office was like all Dylan, right? The living room was like almost like half of the living room was all Streisand. And I got yelled at. I'll share something personal with you. I'm not a gay man. I'm a straight man, and right, exactly. My sister was the main person, but a number of friends yelled at me again and again. David, what are you, crazy? How can you possibly communicate this love for Barbra, who, as you know, is an icon of the gay community, right? I mean, like Judy Garland, all right? And my answer was, well, I'm very secure in my sexuality, but my sister was right. It was a mistake. Anyway, Barbra, after spending so much time with these figures, I really have to tell you, I really have developed a lot. I never was a Barbra Streisand fan. But now that I've done this research, first of all, I feel a connection to her. But more importantly, I've come to appreciate her achievement, her accomplishment. And it tends to be obscured because of the way we see Barbra Streisand now. Streisand has a very long career, does a lot of things over the course of time, and at this moment, we see her as the sum total of that long career. If you just look at the early 60s, however, you just look at that moment when she makes it, where she breaks out, she really is a very different figure. She is a revolutionary figure in many respects, and like Dylan and like Lenny Bruce, is an important influence on the 60s. Streisand, too, inspires much of what will come later. And you've got to look at her early career. Here's her high school graduation photo in 1959. She graduates 6 months early. She hasn't turned 18 yet. She's so strong-willed, and you see it in her face. At the age of 17, she moves into Manhattan to have a career as an actress. And so for the first couple of years, she's going around for auditions. Nobody wants to hire her. She's not exactly a beauty, right? And so she's up against some pretty steep challenge in terms of making it in show business. And the fact that she uses this photo of herself at age 7 to introduce her first television special in 1965, as well as the album, which came out of it, My Name is Barbra, is very interesting, is that she's showing you who she was. She was this ugly duckling. But look at me now, she's saying, because there's something that she does during that period that transforms the way we see her. Do you know another Yiddish term, miskite? Miskite is not a very nice Yiddish word. It means like an ugly duckling. It means an unattractive child, a girl especially, right? She had begun as this miskite from Brooklyn, but within a few short years, she recreates herself as a glamorous star who is beautiful. And she also creates her celebrity based on playing the earlier Jewish star Fanny Brice. Funny Girl, which is her first starring role on Broadway, and then she stars in her first movie called That's Funny Girl, is the story of Fanny Brice. But just here, look at how elegant, look at how beautiful she's become. And yet she still looks like Barbra Streisand. So what I'm not the first to argue this, what Streisand accomplishes is she makes Jewish looks sexy. She makes it certainly more acceptable, and I would suggest to you even more aesthetically appealing to have that ethnic look, to have that especially Ashkenazic Jewish look. Women today owe a lot. Jewish women today owe a tremendous amount to Barbra, I want to suggest to you all. This is in 1960, this has to be before November of 63, because that's when Kennedy is assassinated, right? So this is earlier that year, 1963. She's 22 years old. She has not yet starred on Broadway. She has not yet made a single movie. She's already invited to the White House. She's already become that popular, that famous, if you will, that she is invited to the White House to sing for the president. She says to him, "Oh, you're such a doll." He says to her, "Oh, really, how long have you been singing, Miss Streisand?" She said, "Oh, about as long as you've been president." You know, she's got that kind of cheekiness, that Brooklyn humor, that she is part of who she is and is part of how she's becoming famous. In the 70s, she makes it to the cover of Playboy magazine. And there's a scholar named Henry Beale who argues that this is the moment. And you can't read it because it's in small print, but it says, "What's a nice Jewish girl like me doing on the cover of Playboy?" The answer is, it's now sexy to be Jewish. I mentioned earlier that she also gets some bad press. And here's an example of what I want to suggest to you is a kind of a negative view of her. Mad Magazine did this spoof of Barbra's celebrity, and specifically of her movies. Look at the name of it. On a clear day, you can see a funny girl singing Hello, Dolly Forever. It's a mashup of all of her film titles to that point. And the story inside is pretty funny stuff. The character is not named Barbra Streisand, but rather Bubi Strident. Bubi, Jewish grandmother, Jewish woman. Strident, pushy, aggressive. She's a pushy Jewish woman. You should hear a little bit of sexism and a little bit of anti-Semitism in that. It's not that dissimilar from what will later be the Jap stereotype. Yeah.
But isn't it unfair to? I'm playing devil's advocate.
Yeah, sure.
So,
You can even be an angel's advocate if you want. Yeah.
no, but I mean, like, if she's playing the Jewish character somehow, well, isn't it fair that? Can we call it anti-Semitism if, on the other hand, they're making fun of what she's using as well?
That's what I'm doing. So how are you disagreeing? I didn't hear the disagreement.
Because you say it's a little bit, well, then maybe we disagree on, you say it's a little bit anti-Semitic, but maybe it's just humorous. I mean, she also chose to make reference to her Jewishness.
So you're saying that she's somewhat to blame for putting herself
well, it's
in
kind
the crosshairs. All right. Well, yeah.
Sort of like if she's on the cover of Playboy and she's saying, "What's a nice Jewish girl." So
Right.
she's using this, as you said.
Absolutely.
And they're using it as well, just on the other side, just to bash.
Absolutely, and yeah, I think your point is very well taken. That very often there's a very thin line
Yes.
between the celebrity or us Jewhooing, and sort of making hay out of Jewishness, and then it doesn't. You don't have to go too far for it to for it to turn into something more negative. And you're right that there's a kind of a continuum between them. There's a connection between them. So that's a very, very, very valid point. In the case of Barbra, the negative stuff becomes very clear after a while. For example, the caricatures I showed you of Dylan with the big nose, almost all of them come from Europe. With her, you're going to have the same caricatures with a big ugly face. Again and again and again, they're all American. Let me show you an example.
She's a woman because they're misogynistic besides being
Exactly.
anti-Semitic.
It's both. It's both. You don't have to choose. It's not. It doesn't have to be either or. But it's absolutely because she's a woman, and that makes her a double minority. It makes her extra vulnerable. Absolutely. It becomes safer to attack her because she's just a woman, right? Here is a perfect example of this anti-Streisand thing. Giving her horns, is it possible to say that's not anti-Semitic? Right? This was done by a retired actor in Hollywood named Aaron Kincaid, who did a series of portraits of Hollywood personalities. He gave each one of them a sign of the zodiac. So she apparently is a Taurus, a bull. So it's Barbra Streisand as a bull in a china shop. So you can say, oh, it's not anti-Semitic. It makes no reference to Jews having horns. I mean, simply, it's her being a bull in a china shop. But being a bull in a china shop is saying that she is overly aggressive and pushy and da-da-da. And that is the anti-Semitic part. Those are negative Jewish stereotypes that come up again and again in the history of anti-Semitism. They get expressed with someone like Barbra Streisand because she's such a lightning rod for our thoughts and opinions about her. Okay? You're still not convinced. It's okay. It's okay.
She never really like a heterosexual sex symbol. She always seemed kind of to me more like the draggy Cher, Liza Minnelli type of thing.
Well, I say that her major fan bases are gay men and Jewish women. So I talk about both those groups. Yeah, I think that certainly nowadays it's hard to think of her in those terms. That's why I want to go back to that early part. And you're probably right that probably she was not nearly as popular as like Raquel Welch of the same period. That was a real sex symbol for heterosexual men, as you say. But I think she got more. But putting her in the category of Cher and those other gay icons is looking at where she ended up celebrity-wise. If you look at the journey, if you look at what she represented in the 60s, before she even made a single movie, there is an element of being a sex symbol of a sort. I think you're.
Rap houses and stuff, so it wasn't like she was not.
Oh no, she had a very big gay following from the very start, like Bette Midler, like Sandra Bernhard, like Joan Rivers. So there's a trend there, right? And clearly that's she has greater star power in certain areas. And so you're questioning whether her star power with straight men responding to her as a sex symbol, whether that ever existed at all. And I just want to suggest to you that it was lesser, but it did exist.
Yeah.
One other example I don't have an image for, but another, I think, potent example is in the TV animated series South Park. There were a couple of episodes where they turned Streisand, the name of the episode was Mecha Streisand. They turned Streisand into a Godzilla-like monster, eating up, destroying the city. Now, what is it about Streisand? It's just really... and this is the last image, which is the cover of the museum catalog for the 2 Jewish museum exhibition at the Jewish Museum. Streisand cropped up repeatedly in that exhibition, and this was one of the better known images. The artist I mentioned earlier, Deborah Cass, this was her homage to Streisand as Yentl. You'll all recall that in 1983, Streisand makes a film about a cross-dressing yeshiva student, right? A girl pretending to be a boy so she can study Talmud. That's the Isaac Bashevis Singer story that she uses. It also echoes an old Molly Picon film from the 30s, Yittel mit a Fiddle, so it has some history behind it. Cass, the artist, turns it into an Andy Warhol-like depiction of Streisand as my Elvis, she calls it. It's called Triple Silver Yentl, and then parentheses, my Elvis. So this image of Streisand as a yeshiva boy, the most Jewish image you can imagine of Streisand, is being used by the artist as an expression of her phenomenal celebrity. She's right up there. She's up there with Elvis Presley. Quite a statement. And I'll leave you with that. And this was just a small sampling. I thank you for your patience. I apologize if I went on a bit, but I'd love to chat some more, assuming you still have energy. A lot of people have asked me that. Usually the question is, back when I was writing the book, are you planning to interview them, right? And my answer would be, I would love to if I could. And I even say that in the foreword, and I say, listening? Are you listening, Bob and Barbara? But the real answer is that I didn't make any effort because, to be honest, they would really have nothing to say. If my question is, how do we see them? What are they going to tell me? They really wouldn't have much to comment. Okay, guys, thank you. You're a great audience. Thank you so much for your patience. Thanks for your attention.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.